The road was almost completely empty that night. I had been driving for hours through a stretch of countryside where the highway cut through miles of dark forest. My headlights were the only light anywhere around, and the sound of the engine filled the quiet like a constant hum in the darkness. Around 2 in the morning, I noticed something strange far ahead on the road. At first, it looked like a person walking along the shoulder, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't moving at all. A tall figure stood near the edge of the trees facing the highway. The fog drifting across the road made it difficult to see clearly, but something about the way they stood made me uneasy. When my headlights finally reached them, the figure slowly lifted their head and turned toward my car. Their face looked pale and blank, like someone who had been standing there for hours. I slowed down for a moment, unsure whether to stop and ask if they needed help. But the moment I started to slow, the figure suddenly took one step toward the road. Something about the way they moved felt wrong. I pressed the gas and drove past without stopping. When I checked the rearview mirror a few seconds later, the road behind me was completely empty. There was nowhere the person could have gone. The forest on both sides was thick and dark, and there had been no time for them to disappear. A friend of mine once rented a small apartment above a convenience store in the older part of the city. The building had been there for decades, and most of the other apartments were empty. The landlord said it was quiet and perfect for someone who liked privacy. For the first few nights, nothing unusual happened, but after about a week, my friend started hearing footsteps late at night. Every night around 3 in the morning, someone would walk slowly down the hallway outside his door. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. At first, he assumed it was another tenant, but the sound always stopped directly outside his door. One night, curiosity got the better of him. When the footsteps began again, he quietly walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was completely empty. The overhead lights flickered softly, but there was no one there. The strange part was that the footsteps never stopped. He could still hear them clearly on the other side of the door. After a few seconds, he slowly unlocked the door and pulled it open. The hallway stretched out in both directions with no one in sight. The moment he stepped out into the hallway, the footsteps suddenly started again behind him, this time coming from inside his apartment. When my cousin was in college, he worked the night shift as a security guard at a large office building. His job mostly involved watching security cameras and doing occasional patrols through the empty floors. One night, while watching the monitors, he noticed something strange on one of the cameras that covered the 10th floor hallway. A person was standing at the far end of the hallway facing directly toward the camera. The building should have been completely empty at that hour. At first, he thought it might be a cleaning crew member, but the person wasn't moving at all. They were just standing there, perfectly still. My cousin used the building intercom to call out, but there was no response. After a few minutes, he decided to go upstairs to check it out. When he reached the 10th floor, the hallway was empty. Every office door was locked, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. Confused, he went back down to the security room and looked at the monitors again. The same figure was still on the camera, but now it was standing much closer to the lens. It looked like it had moved halfway down the hallway while he was upstairs. Several years ago, I was driving home late at night when I stopped at a small gas station outside town. The place was quiet except for the buzzing sound of the fluorescent lights above the pumps. While I was filling the tank, I noticed another car parked on the far side of the building. A man was sitting inside it, completely still, watching the store entrance. I didn't think much of it until I went inside to pay. The cashier looked nervous and kept glancing toward the windows. When I mentioned the car outside, the cashier immediately walked over and locked the front door. He told me that the same car had been parked there for almost 2 hours, and the driver hadn't moved once. The strange part was that every time the cashier checked the security camera facing the pumps, the car wasn't visible on the screen. According to the camera footage, that side of the parking lot had been empty the entire time. A former coworker once told me about the night he stayed alone in his grandfather's old farmhouse. The house was built nearly 100 years ago and had been empty since his grandfather passed away. Around midnight, he began hearing faint scratching sounds coming from somewhere in the walls. At first, he assumed it was mice or some other small animals, which would have been normal for an old house. But the scratching slowly turned into knocking. 3 slow knocks coming from inside the wall beside his bed. He tapped the wall with his knuckles, almost jokingly. Immediately 3 knocks came back from the other side. He sat there frozen, staring at the wall. The knocking stopped for a few seconds before starting again, this time from a different wall across the room. One night when I was younger, my family stayed at a motel during a long road trip. I woke up suddenly sometime after midnight feeling strangely uneasy. The room was dark except for a faint glow from a streetlight outside the window. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a shape outside the glass. Someone was standing right against the window, staring into the room. Their face was pressed against the glass, and their eyes were wide open. I tried to wake my parents, but before I could say anything, the figure suddenly moved away from the window. The next morning, we realized something terrifying. Our room had been on the 3rd floor, and there was no balcony outside the window. A group of friends from my neighborhood once explored an abandoned hospital outside town. The building had been closed for years, and most of the windows were broken. They brought cameras and flashlights to record everything. While reviewing the footage later that night, they noticed something none of them had seen while they were inside. In one clip, they were walking down a long hallway laughing and talking. Behind them, a door slowly opened on its own. A tall, dark shape crawled out into the hallway and followed them for several seconds before disappearing into another room. A delivery driver I knew once told me about a strange house he had to deliver a package to late one evening. The house stood alone at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by thick trees. When he knocked on the door, it slowly opened by itself. The inside of the house was completely dark. He called out, but no one answered. Just as he was about to leave, he heard slow footsteps coming from deeper inside the house. The strange part was that the sound seemed to be coming from above him, even though the house only had 1 floor. My neighbor once described the night she woke up to the sound of knocking on her bedroom window. She lived in a single-story house, but the window was several feet above the ground outside. At first, she assumed it was a branch hitting the glass, but the knocking was too steady and deliberate. 3 knocks, pause, then 3 more. When she finally gathered the courage to pull back the curtain, there was nothing outside. The moment she closed the curtain again, the knocking started once more, this time from the inside of the glass. A man who worked night shifts at a grocery store told me about the strangest closing shift he ever experienced. He was locking up the store around midnight when he heard something fall in one of the aisles. When he walked over to check, he saw a shopping cart slowly rolling toward him down the empty aisle. The store was completely silent, and there was no one else inside. The cart stopped just a few feet away before slowly turning and rolling back the direction it came from. Later, when he checked the security cameras, he noticed the cart hadn't been moving on its own. Something invisible seemed to be pushing it. A college student once installed a small security camera in his apartment after hearing strange noises at night. For several nights, the recordings showed nothing unusual. Then, one morning, he watched footage from around 2 in the morning. The camera showed him sleeping peacefully in bed. But after about 10 minutes, the closet door slowly opened by itself. A dark shape leaned out from inside and remained there watching him sleep for nearly an hour before quietly closing the door again. A truck driver told a story about driving through a remote desert highway when he noticed headlights following him in the distance. The car behind him stayed the same distance away for nearly 40 miles. Eventually, the car sped up and passed him. As it drove by, he saw a man sitting in the driver's seat staring straight ahead with a blank expression. 10 minutes later, the truck driver reached a stretch of road where police lights were flashing. A car had crashed badly into the side of the highway. The vehicle was the same car that had just passed him, and according to the police report, the crash had happened hours earlier. One of the creepiest stories I ever heard came from a friend who worked at a hotel. Late one night, the front desk phone rang, and a quiet voice asked if room 312 was still occupied. My friend checked the system and confirmed that someone had checked into the room earlier that evening. The voice on the phone went silent for a few seconds before whispering something strange. It said that was impossible because the person who had booked that room had died earlier that afternoon. A man living alone in a cabin deep in the woods once installed motion cameras outside his property after hearing strange noises at night. One morning, he reviewed the footage and saw something walking across his yard around 3 in the morning. The figure was extremely tall and thin, moving slowly through the darkness. It walked directly up to the front door and stood there for several hours without moving. When the man opened the door later that morning, he found a set of deep footprints in the dirt leading to the door, but none leading away. The last story was told to me by a night janitor who worked in an old school building. Every night, he cleaned the same empty hallways after the students had gone home. One evening while mopping the floor near the gymnasium, he heard the sound of a basketball bouncing